In the final years of World War II, Germany had witnessed its most experienced armies being annihilated by their enemies. The fighters, who had once seemed infinite, were now scarce and could not replace the losses suffered in combat. But the Nazis had a source of personnel that was still intact: the children of the Hitler Youth. Trained from a young age to follow their party's ideology with blind fanaticism, these youths had been programmed to sacrifice their lives in defense of their country. And that is what they did. Whether on the battlefield or behind enemy lines, they died by the thousands, fighting a war that was already impossible to win. Germany's future was crumbling before the impassive eyes of the Nazi leaders. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about the death of the Hitler Youth during World War II. This organization was created in 1922, just 2 years after the founding of the German National Socialist Party. Initially, it was not named after its leader, but was simply known as the Youth League. From its inception, its main goal was to recruit and train new members for the Assault Section, or SA, as the main Nazi armed wing was known at that time. Only Aryan males aged 14 to 18 were allowed entry, but seeing the success of the organization, 2 subsidiaries were created to reach a higher percentage of the population: the German Youth of the Hitler Youth for boys aged 10 to 14, and the League of German Girls for the female sector. A year after its formation, the League had a little over 1,200 members, but Adolf Hitler's rapid rise to fame caused these numbers to increase exponentially throughout the 1920s. By 1932, months before the Nazis came to power, around 108,000 youths were already part of its ranks. A year later, the number had risen to 300,000. This incredible figure was partly achieved because other smaller youth organizations were absorbed by the Hitler Youth, often by force. Thus, they became the only youth institution throughout Germany. By that time, they were already an official part of the Assault Section. Let's hear from a former member speaking about their reasons for joining this group.
Para ser sincero, quería unirme porque era una forma de salir del pueblo. No teníamos electricidad ni agua corriente en casa. Los niños teníamos que ayudar en la cosecha y en otros trabajos del campo. Así que salir de excursión con las juventudes hitlerianas era algo nuevo, una forma de huir de la rutina. Además, era divertido. En general, fue una experiencia fantástica.
But even in those times, several years before any armed conflict between nations, events were beginning to occur that foretold the fate of many of these youths. One such event happened on January 24, 1932. Members of the Hitler Youth, on the eve of the elections that would bring the Führer to power, had become more aggressive in their campaigns. This, combined with their intolerant ideology, made clashes with other political groups, such as the German Communist parties, increasingly frequent and violent. On this date, while the Nazi youths were handing out pamphlets, they were confronted by their opponents. The resulting fight led to the stabbing death of Herbert Norkus, who was just 15 years old. Thus, long before the war began, National Socialism began to claim its first victims among the youth. Norkus's death, instead of serving as an opportunity for reflection, was exploited by the party's propaganda. The teenager was turned into a martyr and a role model. Films and mandatory reading novels were made for the Hitler Youth, and numerous schools, streets, and squares were named after him. And of course, it was used to fuel the hatred against the savage communists and other minorities that threatened Aryan survival. Of course, not all German boys and girls agreed with Nazi ideology, but many still ended up joining their ranks. Those who were not affiliated were constantly harassed by group members in all sectors of society. They were mocked by their classmates and tortured by their teachers, and could even be denied their diploma upon finishing their studies, leaving them without access to university. After graduation, it was also difficult for them to find a job, as many employers rejected any apprentice who didn't belong to the Hitler Youth. Additionally, they could suffer political persecution. Parents who did not enroll their children in the organization were investigated by the authorities. The pressure the Nazi Party exerted to have young people join this group was because they saw its members as the future of Germany. That's why they sought to shape their minds with their twisted ideology from a young age. They were forced to adopt racism and Aryan superiority as a model to follow, and to view Jews, Slavs, and Asians, among others, as subhuman. They were also indoctrinated to reject religion and the authority of the church. Meetings of these groups were even dismantled, Bible study classes were spied on, and attendance at masses was interfered with. Mein Kampf, the book written by Hitler, was read weekly along with other party texts. Above all, there was one idea that had to be imprinted on them. The survival of the Reich was far more important than their own lives. It had to be defended unto death. Sports activities within the Hitler Youth also played a very important role. Although the Nazi leaders did not see it as a way to stay healthy, but rather as a means to begin training teenagers for war. It was given a utilitarian purpose, and the idea of participating in sports solely for recreation was treated with disdain. Anyone who was not skilled in these activities was mistreated, as recounted in this stark account.
No solo los despreciaban, también sufrían abusos y humillaciones. Algunos líderes de las juventudes hitlerianas los maltrataban. Los dejaban de lado, a veces les daban palizas, los pegaban. Eso era horrible. Fue un periodo muy malo. Los que éramos más atléticos podíamos hacer ciertas cosas sin esfuerzo. Los que no eran tan hábiles pagaban por ello su torpeza.
Physical training became more important than academic studies, which were relegated to a secondary role. By the late 1930s, as the Führer was finalizing the details of his invasion of Europe, military activities were added to the youth's schedule. Shooting practice, combat tactics and strategies, assault movements, this and more was taught relentlessly. Gradually, they managed to turn most of these boys and girls into ardent fanatics of National Socialism, willing to give their lives for an Aryan Germany. Unfortunately, they would soon have the opportunity to put this to the test. World War II began on September 1st, 1939. It didn't take long for these Nazi youth to be incorporated into the German war effort, though initially they were not actively involved in combat. Their tasks consisted of assisting with logistical duties, such as postal services or railways. They were also used to help with casualties from Allied bombings, clearing rubble, or working in fire brigades. However, as British air raids became more frequent, the older youths, who were no more than 18 years old, were trained in the use of anti-aircraft weapons to protect the cities. Even so, still far from the front lines, these youths continued to fall.
da sind also ein paar Jabos erschienen und haben diese Lokomotive und diese Güterwaggons also in Wechsel geschlossen. Dieser Freund von mir sagt, ja, sagt, da haben wir wieder Schwein gehabt, aber ich habe einen Stein in den Rücken gekriegt. Und da schaut er mich so an und da sehe ich schon, also, also wenn, ja, wie soll man das beschreiben, also wenn der Blick so weggeht und denke mir, na du, und dann hat er sich ein bisschen gedreht noch. Und dann habe ich gesehen, also der ganze Rücken war also ein einziges Loch. Der hat so eine 2 Zentimeter Granate in den Rücken gekriegt. Also, und da war nichts mehr zu wollen.
But their role began to change in 1942. The war, which the Nazi leaders had envisioned as a quick and decisive conflict, was dragging on longer than expected. It had also expanded beyond Western Europe, with fronts in Africa, the Middle East, and recently the Soviet steppe. Worse still, the German troops were suffering heavy casualties, particularly in the latter theater of operations, so fighters needed to be replaced. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, which had replaced the SA as the party's main paramilitary organization, came up with the idea of recruiting members of the Hitler Youth. Their fervor and fanaticism for the indoctrinated ideology would be very useful in confronting the enemies of the Reich. In 1943, Adolf Hitler approved the creation of a combat unit composed almost exclusively of members from the organization. Initially, only members aged 17 and 18 would be employed. In addition to reinforcing their physical and military training, the cruelty they should exhibit towards Germany's rivals was emphasized repeatedly. There was no room for mercy. By 1944, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend was ready to see action. For their baptism of fire, they were sent to the beaches of Normandy to face the Allied amphibious invasion scheduled for June 6th. Among the members of this unit and teenagers from other groups, around 20,000 Hitler Youth participants took part in defending the French coast. The division fought with the almost suicidal ferocity with which they had been indoctrinated, and despite their young age and lack of experience, they managed to destroy 28 enemy tanks. But fanaticism is of little use against waves of seasoned attackers. By the time the assault ended, 3,000 boys and girls had been killed. Throughout June, they continued to face the Allied advances on the conquered territory. With each passing day, the high morale they once had gradually diminished. The idea of German invincibility that their instructors had repeated ad nauseum was shattered with each friend who fell to enemy fire. But the situation for the German youths was about to worsen. By the second half of 1944, the Nazis were in retreat not only due to the Allied invasion of France, but also because of the rapid Soviet advance in the east. The dead combatants could no longer be replaced by the male population of military age, so the German leaders decided to turn to ever younger children to wield weapons. Now, 14-year-old soldiers, often wearing uniforms and boots too large for them, had to face the experienced troops of the Red Army. Those as young as 10 or 12 were used for support tasks, such as messengers or ammunition carriers. While the party's propaganda emphasized the bravery of these young volunteers, the reality was different.
Das wurde befohlen. Das war wie beim Militär. Da hatten wir auch gar keine, da konnten wir auch nicht sagen, ich gehe da nicht hin. Dann hätten da wäre vielleicht mein Vater ins KZ gekommen oder die Mutter bestraft, so war das da. Man musste sich freiwillig melden.
To make their situation even worse, many of these miners were added to SS divisions. This organization was responsible for carrying out the brutal tasks of eliminating the Jewish and Slavic populations from Soviet territory. The burning of villages and the mass murder of civilians and prisoners of war were just some of the crimes committed by these men. The Russians had a particular hatred for SS members, and many of those who fell into their hands were executed without trial as an act of revenge. This included members of the Hitler Youth. There were cases where their lives were spared due to their age, but in other instances they joined their older comrades in death or in prisoner of war camps. Due to the terrible conditions in these camps, where they were forced to work without rest, many also ended up perishing. As the year progressed into 1945, Germany found itself in an increasingly desperate situation. Its best armies, with the most experienced and battle-hardened troops, had been devastated by their enemies. They were forced to rely more frequently on younger and older individuals. When the war reached German territory, there were no longer any civilians for the Nazis. Everyone had to fight and give their lives for the Reich. This included increasingly younger boys and girls. Some soldiers reported facing, and at times killing, opponents as young as 8 years old. Others were not incorporated into the regular army, but were part of militias composed of those unqualified for enlistment in the regular armed forces. These were called Volkssturm, meaning People's Storm. Although they fought until the end of the war, their efforts were entirely in vain. Poorly equipped and barely trained, they were frequently sent to confront the powerful tanks of the Allies. Sometimes they didn't even have the strength to handle the grenade launchers they were given. Their superiors consciously sent them on suicide missions, using them merely as cannon fodder to delay the enemy advance for a short time. Those who did not fight on the front lines were engaged behind enemy lines as partisans. This was another of the desperate measures Germany undertook to try to reverse the inevitable outcome of the war. The werewolf, as these men and women were known, were mainly tasked with sabotage and espionage activities. Once again, children and teenagers were heavily utilized. But once more, the poor organization by German leaders resulted in these missions having a negligible effect. Many members of these guerrilla groups were captured, mostly by the Western Allies. Those who were not killed in combat were sometimes executed as spies. The most well-known case is that of Heinz Petri and Josef Schoner, 16 and 17 years old respectively, who were caught spying on American soldiers. Their young age was no excuse for the Americans, who, after a brief trial, sentenced both to death. Despite media attention and controversy over the verdict, the two teenagers were executed shortly after the war ended. We can see how the Nazis' attempts to enlist the children of Germany, the future of the Reich, only led to their deaths. It did nothing to change the final outcome of the conflict. By April 1945, the Soviets were at the gates of Berlin. Hitler had ordered that they must fight to the last drop of blood. Surrender was not an option. This applied not only to soldiers but also to civilians. Children and teenagers who had managed to avoid being sent to the front now had to take up arms and fight against the Red Army. They were joined by Hitler Youth members fighting alongside the SS. In both cases, they were often used as anti-tank brigades, hiding among the rubble of the German capital until the armored vehicles came close. Many of these youths continued to be victims of the party's indoctrination, sharing the Führer's illusory vision that victory was still possible. This led them to fight with more ferocity and daring than many veteran soldiers who already understood that they had been defeated. Even when surrounded by the enemy, they fought to the death. The Russians were horrified when, after fierce battles, they saw that the bodies in the positions they had fought so hard to take often did not exceed the age of 16.
Da waren Jungen, die waren so fanatisch, die waren fanatischer als die Alten. Die wären für den Hitler gestorben, die wären durch Fenster gesprungen. Also bei denen musste man vorsichtig sein, vorsichtiger als bei Erwachsenen. Die waren in einem Wahn, die waren dem Ganzen, also sagen wir mal Hitler, hörig. Die waren hörig, schlicht und einfach. Und die hätten alles getan.
In the final days of April, General Helmuth Weidling, responsible for defending Berlin, ordered the dissolution of the combat units of the Hitler Youth. He wanted to avoid unnecessary bloodshed, but amid the chaos that characterized the city at the time, the order was never implemented. Until the unconditional surrender of German forces on May 8, 1945, the children continued to die. According to some sources, of the Hitler Youth members who participated in the Battle of Berlin, only 2 survived. With the end of the war in Europe, the organization was disbanded and its symbols banned. Although there was evidence that several of its members had participated in and committed war crimes, they were not tried due to their age. Some of their leaders were sentenced to prison, but their sentences were light compared to those of other Reich leaders. As part of the denazification process, it was mandatory for these youths to learn about the atrocities committed during the 6 years of conflict. Many of them were never able to overcome the indoctrination and became part of clandestine groups seeking to revive Hitler's ideas. However, others over the years came to realize that their actions had supported a murderous regime. Not only were those deemed inferior by the Nazis exterminated, but their fanatical ideology also led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of German boys and girls. We've reached the end of the video and want to ask you, do you think these young people were responsible for their actions? Don't leave without leaving your answer in the comments box and subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.